There's this moment in The Warrior and the Sorceress where David Carradine slowly walks into a dusty desert town that looks like it was built in 3 days behind a supermarket. The walls are fake, the lighting makes absolutely no sense. Every sword clash sounds like somebody hitting a frying pan, and at any moment, a half-naked cultist or some horrifying four-armed rubber monster can wander into frame like the movie suddenly remembered it's supposed to be fantasy. And honestly, I kind of love it. Because these old 80s fantasy movies weren't trying to convince you they were real. They weren't obsessed with immersion. They weren't terrified of looking silly. They didn't care if the sets looked artificial, or if the monsters looked rubbery, or if the cave was obviously filled with colored stage lights. They felt closer to live theater than modern blockbuster cinema. Like a Broadway production escaped the theater and started fighting monsters in the desert. And somehow that artificially gives these movies more personality than a lot of modern fantasy. Movies like Conan the Destroyer and The Warrior and the Sorceress usually gets dismissed as a dumb B movies. Cheap sets, bad choreography, questionable acting, plot that barely functions. But I honestly think people misunderstand why these movies still work, because the fakeness is the point. The town in The Warrior and the Sorceress doesn't even feel like a real civilization. It feels temporary. Like one strong gust of wind could knock the entire movie over. Everybody is sweating constantly. The taverns are full of smoke for absolutely no reason. Every room glows blue or red like somebody discovered colored lighting 5 minutes before filming. Nothing looks realistic, but everything feels memorable. And I think modern fantasy lost that summer along the way. Today fantasy wants to feel grounded. Everything is grey, everything is desaturated. Everybody whispers their dialogue like they're afraid of something dramatic. Even magical worlds are terrified of looking too fantasy. Everybody wants realism now. Realistic dirt, realistic armor, realistic lighting, realistic trauma, realistic politics. But fantasy was never supposed to feel realistic. Fantasy is supposed to feel mythological. And 80s fantasy understood that. It wanted giant monsters, ridiculous costumes, fog-filled caves, over-dramatic music, impossible sets. It wanted spectacle. It wanted to feel like somebody adapted an ancient myth onto a theater stage and accidentally filmed it. And honestly, I miss that. Conan the Destroyer genuinely feels like a recorded Dungeons and Dragons campaign where the dungeon master completely lost control of logic halfway through the session. Imagine sitting at a table with your character sheet while the DM leans forward and says, "A mysterious queen promises to resurrect your dead girlfriend if you retrieve a magical artifact from an ancient fortress." And instead of asking literally any follow-up questions, the barbarian player just says, "Yeah, alright." That's the movie. Conan never asks how the resurrection works. He never questions the queen. He just immediately accepts the quest because the script needs him walking toward the next dungeon. And weirdly enough, that's part of the charm. The movie operates entirely on dream logic, not realistic logic, dream logic. Things happen because they feel mythological, not because they make practical sense. That's actually how a lot of ancient myths work too. Heroes accept bizarre quests from suspicious strangers. Magic works when it's dramatically convenient. Characters survive impossible situations because the story needs them to continue wandering into stranger and stranger places. Even the structure of the movie feels like a tabletop roleplay. The group enters a city, they meet suspicious NPCs, somebody gives them a quest, they travel through weird locations, fight increasingly bizarre monsters, then immediately move on to the next encounter. It barely feels like a screenplay. It feels like a DM flipping through notes while improvising. And Conan the Destroyer fully commits to that energy. The funniest part is that the real Conan from the original Robert E. Howard stories is actually much smarter than the movie version. The public version of Conan is basically big muscles, little brain. A guy who punches camels and solves every problem by screaming louder than everyone else. But the original Conan? He's intelligent. The book Conan speaks multiple languages. He's a tactician, a thief, a pirate, a mercenary. Eventually, he becomes a king who spends nights reading ancient scrolls. There's actual melancholy to him. He feels dangerous because he understands the world around him. Then you get to Conan the Destroyer, and suddenly Conan has the intelligence stat of a decorative croc. This man accepts magical resurrection terms without asking for clarification once. Bombata practically tries to assassinate him every 20 minutes, and Conan still acts surprisingly every single time. At some point, you stop watching him as a human being, he becomes an archetype. He's not really Conan, he's the barbarian, a giant stage prop carrying a sword through a fantasy amusement park. And honestly, that simplicity rarely helps the movie feel larger than life. The characters aren't grounded people, they're mythological pieces moving across a stage. And that theatrically becomes even funnier once you get to Bombata, possibly the worst undercover assassin in fantasy history. The Queen's plan is already insane. She sends Conan to retrieve an artifact, but secretly orders Bombata to kill him afterward. Okay, but here's the problem. She has a kingdom, an army, professional soldiers. If Conan can be overwhelmed by enough enemies, which the movie literally shows earlier, why not just send 50 soldiers into the cave? Why build this absurd betrayal subplot? Because the movie isn't functioning on realistic political logic, it's functioning on fantasy stage logic. The queen needs a barbarian hero, betrayals, monster fights, suspicious henchmen, and dramatic sword confrontations. So the script brute forces everybody into those scenarios like a desperate dungeon master improvising after free energy drinks. And Bombata himself is incredible because he radiates betrayal so aggressively that it becomes comedy. Every scene feels like he's one sentence away from saying, "By the way, I'm obviously going to murder you later." But Conan never notices because the movie still needs another action sequence first. It's like watching a D&D player fail every stealth roll imaginable while the DM keeps mercy rerolling behind the screen. And somehow, it works. Not because it's realistic, but because it's entertaining. And honestly, I think modern fantasy sometimes forgets the entertainment matters more than realism. A movie can have perfect world building and still feel emotionally dead. Meanwhile, Conan the Destroyer feels like a drunken campfire story somebody made up 5 minutes ago, and somebody that energy makes it memorable. But if Conan the Destroyer feels like chaotic D&D, The War and the Sorceress feels like somebody adapted a fever dream. Most people dismiss the movie as a cheap Conan ripoff, but what makes it fascinating is that it's basically Yojimbo by Akira Kurosawa filtered through pure 1980s sword and sorcery exploitation madness. Same wandering mercenary setup, same rival factions manipulating each other, same cynical drifter protagonist. Except now everything is covered in smoke, synth music, glowing cave lights, and absolutely unbelievable amount of nudity. This movie has zero shame. Every creative decision feels completely unrestrained. The costumes are ridiculous. The sets barely resemble real architecture. Every room looks like it was decorated by somebody who just discovered fog machines. There are scenes where the lighting turns bright blue for absolutely no reason other than blue looks cool. And honestly, they were right. Modern fantasy would never allow itself to look like this anymore. Everything now has to feel believable, controlled, grounded. Even magical words feel afraid of excess. But the War and the Sorceress fully embraces excess, and because of that, every scene sticks in your brain. David Carradine spends the entire movie wandering through this bizarre world, looking simultaneously exhausted and strangely cool. Half the time, he feels less like a fantasy hero and more like a tired rock musician who accidentally entered another dimension. And then you get to the monster scenes. The monsters in this movie are incredible because they look so undeniably fake. Not fake in a cynical way, fake in a theatrical way. You can almost imagine the actors sweating inside the costumes under burning studio lights while smoke fills the room and synthesizers scream in the background. And weirdly enough, that physical presence makes the world feel tangible. Modern fantasy often hides behind realism. Everything is dark, muted, desaturated. Everybody talks quietly. Everybody acts emotionally restrained. Even magic feels restrained now, but 80s fantasy had absolutely no shame. It was colorful, sweaty, horny, overdramatic, completely excessive. And because these movies weren't trying to hide their absurdity, they became memorable. That's the thing I think modern fantasy forgot. Fantasy is supposed to feel unreal, not realistic. Unreal. Like somebody telling you an impossible story around a fire while making half of it up as they go. Here's the controversial part. I honestly think these obviously fake practical effects often age better emotionally than mediocre CGI. Not because they look more realistic, they don't. A rubber monster from 1984 still looks like a rubber monster. But your brain processes it differently. You accept it as part of the performance, part of the stage play. Meanwhile, modern CGI often gets trapped in this awkward middle ground where it desperately wants to look real but never fully convinces you, or lacks funding. That's where the weird and candy feeling comes from. 80s fantasy avoided that problem entirely by embracing theatricality. These movies weren't trying to perfectly simulate reality, they were trying to create spectacle. And honestly, I think modern fantasy lost something important when everything became obsessed with grounding itself. Everything now has the same grey lighting, the same muddy color palette, the same self-righteous dialogue, the same fear of looking too strange. Meanwhile, old fantasy films felt like somebody's bizarre dream, projected directly onto a screen. Messy, artificial, sometimes stupid, but alive. I'm not saying these are masterpieces, half the time the plots barely function. The choreography looks like stuntmen politely waiting their turn. The monsters are made of foam, and Conan himself occasionally seems confused by the concept of object permanence. But these movies understood something modern fantasy forgot. Fantasy is supposed to feel like a performance, like spectacle, like myth. That's why I can forgive the fake sets, the bizarre costumes, the ridiculous acting, the obvious props, because they feel human. Like a group of actors and stuntmen physically sweating under hot studio lights trying to bring some impossible fantasy world to life with whatever they had available. And honestly, I'd rather watch David Carradine stumble through a cardboard desert town fighting a four-armed rubber god than another perfectly rendered grey CGI kingdom designed by a committee. Because at least those old movies had the courage to be weird.